So the next set of students, as Beth indicated, is going to be Son Brandon and Kevin McGee. Son and Brandon looked into how charter schools accumulate fiscal savings, rainy day funds, and so on. A couple of words about Son and Kevin. Son grew up in Harrisburg. He has a bachelor's from Franklin and Marshall, majoring in economics with a minor in mathematics. For the past 6 years, Son works as a budget analyst in the Pennsylvania General Assembly for the Democratic House Appropriations Committee. His focus is on the state's education budget, but he has also done a lot of work in economic development as well as environmental issues. And Kevin, he's also a local here. He grew up in Menayong. He has a bachelor's in criminal justice from Wagner University. After working for Philadelphia Police Department for about 5 years, he decided to change departments and move into Abington Township Police Department. He has been there for about 15 years, since 2003, and he is currently the lieutenant overseeing a platoon in the patrol division. He graduates next semester in spring. Son, he is a new addition to our program, and he is lucky enough, both Son and Beth are lucky enough to have me as their professor. We're working together, and I'm just pushing them around a lot, but I appreciate a lot your work. And with that said, okay, let's welcome Son and Kevin.
Sean and I studied some fiscal effects with respect to charter school fund balances. So that's what we'll be going over with everyone here today. I'll be doing a portion, and Sean will be doing a portion as well, to hopefully give you a good comprehensive view of the results that we had from our study here. There's 3 reasons that we need to study the fiscal effects that impact charter schools. One, there's very little literature out there for us to look into to give us any picture as to what impacts charter school districts. But what we do know is charter school districts do have an impact on their corresponding home school districts in which they reside, and they also have an impact in the local governments with which they reside as well. So it's important to us to take a look at not only what fiscal factors are affecting the school districts and what fiscal factors are affecting the local governments, but it's important to look at the resource allocation. How much is this impacting those local school districts? All we currently have is just fiscal impacts that the charter schools have. No one's actually looked into what impacts those charter schools itself. And that's really important to look at for further down the road for future expansion. Also, we need to look at fiscal savings. We know what local governments do. They rely heavily on their unassigned fund balance when times of economic downturn, which is really important. The corresponding school districts, pretty much the same. Current literature tells us that. But what we don't have is a bigger picture into what actually happens with the charter schools with respect to their unassigned fund balance. And that's going to be a growing element since they are a greater portion of the school districts and the local governments in which they reside. Also, state lawmakers have tried before to put restrictions on the unassigned fund balance back in 2017-18 with the Bill 97. Policymakers tried to put some restrictions on what it was they could save. Before they actually do that, it's important for us to take a look at those fiscal savings and how they're going to impact the charter schools.
So a quick overview of our regression model and methodology. Our dependent variables, the unassigned fund balance, UFB, and then our independent variables fit into 3 categories: revenues, expenditures, and demographics. And what we found was that depending on the type of charter school, there were different results in terms of what factors affected the unassigned fund balance. So we ran 3 separate regressions, 1 for each: brick and mortar, regional, and cyber. And the models were more or less the same. We did tweak the cyber one because we had some multicollinearity issues with local revenues and enrollment. And we also took out a geographic variable because they have the distance education model. But otherwise, the models were the same. We were using panel data from 2013 to 2017. So we had a pooled OLS regression. We lagged the independent variables to account for endogeneity and autocorrelation, and then we used robust standard errors to address the heteroscedasticity issues we had. And so what you saw there was sort of a shortened version of the equation. Here it is in long form with all the independent variables. You can see we have local and state, federal revenues, instructions, expense, administration, et cetera, and some demographic ones such as free and reduced lunch, ethnic diversity, and some geographic ones. And Kevin's going to talk a little bit about the hypotheses we developed.
These are just 3 of the sample hypotheses that we have here. We obviously had much more data we had collected, and we had hypotheses for every data branch that we had. But just to give you an idea and a small picture into what we were looking at, the revenue hypothesis here with local revenue, we expected that to have a positive correlation with our unassigned fund balance. The more local revenue that the charter schools are pulling in, the more the unassigned fund balance would increase as a result, and corresponding for the decrease in local revenue would cause a decrease in the unassigned fund balance. As far as expenditures, the instructional expense here, we did expect that to have a negative correlation. The more that the charter schools are spending to educate the students, the lower the amount of money they're going to be able to save in their unassigned fund balance. And corresponding, the less their instructional expense, the higher the savings in the unassigned fund balance. We also took a look at demographics. That was just as important as the revenue and the expenses. And we came up with some really interesting results, which we'll get to later in the presentation. But free and reduced lunch, which is a measure of income, was something we looked at. We expected that to have a negative correlation. The number of students eligible for the program would certainly cause a decrease. The school district or charter schools are paying more for those students, causing a decrease and less savings for the actual charter schools themselves. So if we build off the last slide, these are the variables, or some of the variables that we took a look at. You can see the revenue variables there, which we did as a measure of total revenue. The expenditure variables there, the instruction, administration, operation, maintenance cost. We did that as a ratio or share of the total instructional or total expenditure costs. You can see right next to that the data sources. This information here was gathered from the Pennsylvania Department of Education, the annual financial reports. And on the far right there, you can see what impact we expected that to have on the unassigned fund balance. And what's interesting to note is you can see that all the revenue variables here, we expect to have a positive correlation with the unassigned fund balance, whereas the expenditure items here, we expect to have a negative correlation with the unassigned fund balance. So this is the demographics that we took a look at here. Enrollment, English proficiency, ethnic diversity, the free and reduced for lunch, the rural binary, the urban binary. They all had different outcomes, which we could show you in the models later on in the presentation here. The enrollment, just the total number of students, English proficiency, ethnic diversity, the free and reduced lunch, the rural binary, urban binary. You can see the demographics here, or the variables that we expected to have a higher impact on the charter schools, or ones that require more service delivery, or that have the students that require the most service delivery. English proficiency, ethnic diversity, the free and reduced lunch, we expect those to have a negative correlation with the unassigned fund balance, as well as the rural and urban binary, which are generally lower income areas. And the lower income areas, obviously, and from prior research, tell us that those students require more demand for services, causing the charter schools to be able to save less in their unassigned fund balance.
So once we built our data set, the first thing we did was run some descriptive statistics, and we compared school districts to charter schools. And I want to point out a couple of things here. The median enrollment between school districts and charter schools, the median school district has about 4 times as many students as the median charter school. But all the way on the right, you can see in the maximum column that the largest charter school has about 10,000 students, and that is a cyber charter school. So the largest charter schools are the cybers. Moving down the list, you can see that free and reduced lunch, which is a program for low-income students, so you're measuring income there. Charter schools have a greater concentration of lower-income students. Similarly, they have a larger concentration of non-white students, and if you remember from Beth's presentation, she talked about where charters are located. A lot of them are in Philadelphia and Allegheny County, in urban areas, and you see parents in those areas and poor schools that are underperforming are choosing to send their kids to charters, which is why you see this discrepancy in income levels and ethnic diversity. And finally, there are comparable levels of special ed and English language learner students. So this is a similar slide, except now we're examining financial differences between school districts and charter schools. Moving down from the top, you have very similar instruction and regular ed between school districts and charter schools. School districts spend a little bit more on special education, and what's pretty interesting is that charter schools spend more than twice the amount at the median on administration costs as a share of total expenditures. They're also slightly higher in operation and maintenance, and because school districts are primarily responsible for transporting students, they have a higher transportation cost than charters do. And finally, school districts have a lot more debt because in a lot of cases charter schools are leasing their facilities, so they don't have the major construction expenses. These graphs compare the median fund balances. On the left, you have school districts. You see that they allocate funds in all three types of fund balances, but most of it is going to the unassigned fund balance. On the right, charter schools do not put at the median any funds in the committed or assigned fund balances, and their unassigned fund balance is trending downward. It was near 8 and 9%, and then it's down near 6% now. So what the last few slides did was establish a difference between school districts and charter schools. The next thing we did was look at the differences within charter schools, the three types, the brick and mortar, regional, and cyber charter school. And you see that all three of the types have a median committed fund balance and assigned fund balance of 0. And when you're looking at the unassigned fund balance, regional had the highest and cybers had the lowest amount. When comparing enrollment, the regional had the, let me point it out for you. Looking at enrollment between the three, the regional had the lowest enrollment, and cyber and brick and mortar had similar levels of enrollment, but if you look at the standard deviation, the next thing down after the median, the standard deviation for cyber enrollment is very large. It shows that cybers they're either pretty small or very large schools. And another thing that's interesting, from all the way, the second column from the right shows the administration expense. If you look at the median, the top few rows, cyber charter schools have about 16%, which is the largest of the types of schools. So looking at these, we decided that maybe our model should differentiate between these type of schools, and it turns out that's where we got the best results.
So these are our findings. We broke it up from the brick and mortars, the regionals, and the cyber charters. If we just take a look for a moment at the brick and mortar charters, and you can see there by the asterisks along, the administration and operation costs were significant, as well as the student transportation, as well as ethnic diversity and the rural binary. What's interesting to note here is the administration and operation costs, which we expected to have a negative impact, actually did not have a negative impact. They were positively correlated with the unassigned fund balance, which is contrary to our hypothesis here. What we can project and maybe hypothesize is the school districts are doing a better job with long-term budgeting, which maybe allows them to save their funds a little bit easier. Now, it's just an assumption of ours, something we could test a little bit further to find out if, in fact, that is true. When you take a look at the regional charter schools, what we found was that the local revenue was significant state, federal, which is consistent with what we would expect. If they're pulling in more revenue, we would expect them to be able to save more. As also the operation maintenance costs, the administration cost, or the student transportation, excuse me, we expect them to be negatively correlated, which in fact they were, and they are significant. What's actually interesting is if you take a look at the regionals, you could see that the hypothesis for the operation maintenance student transportation are negative, which was what we would expect. If they're spending more money for maintenance and operation, we would expect that to have a negative correlation on the fund balance, which is completely contrary to what we see in the brick and mortars. What we can suggest or assumption we can make here is that maybe the regional charter schools, because they are affiliated with more than one school district, they're pulling in more students, is allowing them to achieve economies of scale a little bit easier, cutting the costs. Now when we get down to the end here and we look at the cyber charters, we can see that the state revenue is significant, debt service, enrollment, limited English proficiency, ethnic diversity, the free and reduced lunch. The demographics play a huge part with respect to cyber charters, which is very interesting. The ones that require the most service delivery, the free and reduced lunch, the ethnic diversity, limited English proficiency, actually are negatively correlated with the fund balance. Something we would have expected. You know, they require more services generally associated with lower income students. What this leads us to believe is because of the distance learning model with the cyber schools. They're not spending as much money on these programs, but at the same point, it's allowing them to go out and gather and pull lower income students, helping them to achieve economies of scale much easier, which was another area that was significant here. When you get down to the bottom here, you could see we studied, well, it's not up on there, but we studied 128 different brick and mortar schools. We studied 10 regional schools and 12 cyber charter schools. Our observations are pretty low here with the regionals and cyber schools just because we only investigated Pennsylvania. Obviously, if we branch the study out a little bit, we would certainly come up with better results. Now, our F statistic and our R squared are certainly respectable here. I imagine if we had more time to play with the data, we could have come up with some more diverse models, but this is the ones that gave us the best results.
So just a summary of our conclusions. First, based on what Beth said, we know that charter schools are an entrenched part of Pennsylvania education landscape, so more attention should be being paid to this, and we hope that this study is a first in a line of them. And second, we think that, well, we can conclude that cyber charter schools should be treated differently than the brick and mortar and the regional based on our regression and on some of the descriptive statistics we ran. Some practical recommendations. The General Assembly, if and when they decide to impose fund restrictions on it, because charter schools vary significantly in size of their student body to school districts, they need to adjust the range accordingly based on, since it's a percentage of total expenditures. And the second conclusion we would make is that there needs to be a more standardized tuition payment that school districts make to charter schools so as to not incentivize charter schools kind of trying to cherry pick lower income students that may come with a higher tuition.
So just looking at our next steps is where we go from here. Certainly we're going to explore other options, take a look at our research, kind of refine it a little bit, see if we can come up with some better results. But we certainly love feedback with respect to any of that, and we're looking for that. That's only going to help us refine our research, refine our conclusions, and refine our research overall. So, we potentially would like to publish the research we have here in the Budget and Finance Journal, the Accounting Journal. Certainly something we're looking to do. So any feedback or any questions that you might have, we're certainly here to answer those for you.
There is no need to refine anything. Findings look amazing. But when we work with statistics, there is always something better we can do. Thank you, guys. Very good. Thank you. Next up, we're going to have a presentation from Aaron. I'll introduce Aaron and a couple of things about his research. So Aaron looked at a similar topic of charter schools, but in particular, he focused on how charter competition, school choice competition, affects fiscal savings of school districts. As we said earlier, when Beth was introducing the topic, charter schools and school districts, they do compete for the same source of funds. And from what you saw earlier from the General Assembly, there is some concern on the fact that charters may be pulling away funds out of our public schools. So Aaron will dig into that and let us know of what his results and finding is. This is a research that Aaron and Beth did together, okay? So Aaron will take over the presentation. A couple of things about Aaron. He grew up in La Canada, California. When I was putting together your introduction, this kind of like threw me off. I was like, La Canada, that sounds Canadian. But it's from California, okay? The US has this kind of like attitude of like stealing names from other countries, I guess. I've seen a lot of Greek cities in the US. I stop and take selfies. No, I'm joking. So after high school, he joined the US Army, first as a cadet at the West Point, and later as an enlisted airborne infantry squad leader. After 7 years in the Army, he became a government contractor, and he worked for the Asymmetric Warfare Group. Then he became a police officer and detective for the DC Metropolitan Police Department. He supervised there a mountain bike squad with 54 officers. Now he's at Villanova and he wants to broaden his skills and maybe make a career change. So hopefully our program will give you the skills that you need in order to make this career change. So let's welcome Aaron. And Aaron will educate us on the impact of charter competition.
Thank you, Theo, for the nice introduction. Like Theo mentioned, we're going to be examining the impact of charter schools and how they compete for financial resources within their school districts. Basically, is the charter school a drag on the school district from which it is authorized? So, as you can see, our research question is pretty basic. It's exactly what I just stated, except in addition to looking at the rainy day fund, otherwise known as the unassigned fund balance, or UFB as we've been referring to it tonight, we're also going to look at the committed and the reserved fund balances to give us a little broader understanding of how the school districts are impacted. Why are we doing this research? That's a good question. One, school districts are a special purpose and small government entity within the state of Pennsylvania. They are autonomous in some sense. So we need to understand how they work. They also have less ability to deal with financial crises as they arise because they have limited revenue sources. They're not as robust as larger governments. Another reason we like to look at them is because in the state of Pennsylvania, they are mandated to have between 8 and 12%. That's the recommendation. But if they want to raise taxes, they have to be below 12% in the unassigned fund balance in order to raise taxes. This research also expands on research previously done. This research looked at the unassigned fund balances, and it also expands upon that, including the different budgets and the funds, and also includes charter school competition as a metrics. First, let's talk about our variables. First, we're going to have 3 dependent variables, which means we're going to be doing multiple studies. We're going to have the committed fund balance, the assigned fund balance, and the unassigned fund balance. All of our data comes from the Department of Education within the state of Pennsylvania. Our independent variables are going to be in the same 3 categories that you've seen earlier tonight. They're going to be in revenues, expenditures, and in demographics. The graph I have up here now shows you what our independent variables are going to be in terms of revenue. Just brief description of what they are, and the plus and minus at the other end is our hypothesis on how they will affect the fund balances we're looking at. So if it's a negative, we expect that to have a negative impact to the fund balance. In other words, for every increase in that unit spending, we expect to see a reciprocal negative impact upon the fund balance. In difference with the previous study that my other colleagues did, we are not across the board with a same hypothesis here for the revenues. We expect local revenues to have a negative impact, where state and federal revenues will have a positive impact. As we go into the expenditures, we have many of the same expenditures that you've seen previously tonight. They were seen in the introduction and the previous study. We do expect these to have a negative impact as well. As you spend more, you save less. It's a continuation of expenditures. These are all the ones that we looked at within our model. As we got into our model, we didn't use all of these variables because of correlation issues. For our demographic values, we had market share, limited English proficiency, diversity index, and the poverty index. For poverty index, we're using the free and lunch program, and that comes from the National School Lunch Program report for our data source. Again, we're expecting negative results here. In other words, as these numbers increase, we're expecting a negative impact on the fund balances we're studying. Our research method, you can see the equation. It's split into the same three sources that you've seen earlier tonight and discussed earlier. We used a pool OLS regression. We lagged RIV. We used time effects and robust standard error corrections. This did a couple of things for us. It corrected our endogeneity, it corrected our autocorrelation, and it took off heterodidacticity. We also squared enrollment, and we did this on purpose. We did this to capture our economies of scales. You heard about this in the previous presentation. We took this into effect, and because of this, we are expecting a high VIF value. For our data, we took 443 school districts that do not authorize charter schools and 39 charter authorizing districts and compared them. Each of these was broken down into a balanced panel data set. What that means is every year has a matching data set from 2013 into 2017. There is no gaps in our data. That way there are no gaps in our model. Again, I want to run through the fund balances that we're going to talk about because they are slightly different than what you've heard about. We have the unassigned fund balance, which is the rainy day balance. We have the committed fund balance, which is a specific purpose fund. It's usually determined by formal action. Usually the school board will come together and say, we want to do this with this money. And then you have the assigned fund balance. This fund balance is not as restrictive as a reserved fund balance, but it becomes close as it is designated for a specific purpose. All our variables were turned into ratios. Ratios allowed us to better model this for the spending and financial aspects that we were looking at. For the district fund balances, all of those were over the total expenditures of the district. All of our revenue values were over total revenues of the district. All of our expenditure variables were over total revenues from the district. And our demographics were over total district enrollment. We ran the three models that we're going to go over in just a moment, but they were for the unassigned fund balance for both authorizing school districts and non-authorizing school districts, the committed fund, and the assigned fund balance. First, we're going to talk about some descriptive statistics. This gives us a general overall picture of what our data set shown. I've highlighted two columns here. One is for charter schools, one is for non-authorizing districts. First thing you can see is with their unassigned fund balance, there is a great size difference. So districts with charter schools tended to be smaller. This kind of comes in counterintuitive because you think Pittsburgh and Philadelphia as maybe trying to skew that, but when the aggregate comes, it doesn't end up being a case where those are skewed data points. You'll also see a difference in the assigned and committed fund balance. What we found is a majority of charter schools do not report these numbers or do not create their finances in a manner to accept these different fund types. That's why you'll see our median is 0. Some charter school districts do actually account for those fund types, but it's rare. Another difference is local taxes, and revenue. These are basically your local sourcing funds. There's a difference between how these funds are distributed in authorizing districts and non-authorizing districts. In districts that don't have charter schools, there's no, it doesn't go on to a second party, aka the charter schools. It stays within school districts, so you're going to see high numbers. School districts will receive this, and then when it goes to the charters, it'll just go as a lump sum. It is not specified out as a local revenue. And because of that, it tracks as a much lower number. As you see, this is not the case with federal revenue, though, as those numbers are vastly similar. Couple more descriptive statistics. In this one, I've highlighted what I want to point out, and that is total expenditures. School districts with charter schools spend significantly less than those without. Again, this is because there are fewer school districts in there, so the size tends to be smaller. This is also echoed within their fund balances. This is the fund balance for non-authorizing school districts and authorizing school districts within their unassigned fund balance. As you can see, generally, if they don't authorize charter schools, they have a much higher unassigned fund balance. I want to show you these 4 graphs. Don't pay attention to the scales of the graphs. That's not the important part here. They do not match. However, their ratios are paired to each other. So if you look at the top orange ones and the bottom blue ones, you'll see that the proportions are very different. The bottom ones are authorizing districts with charter schools. The top are ones without charter schools. You can see there's a discrepancy between state revenues and with administration costs. Administration costs are much lower in a non-authorizing school district when you compare it to those with charter schools. One of the possible reasons for this is charter schools often bring on business personnel for their administration, and these people require larger salaries. Now our first study. This is our first regression. This looks at the unassigned fund balance. What I've done here is I've set it up so you're able to look at the significance. The significance are the asterisk columns. So when those match, you have a direct comparison. You can actually look and see what's going on. Of note in this, and you're going to see this continued out without our models, is when we have a relationship that matches and they both have some significance, they tend to have an opposite effect. So in this one, state revenue. For every increase in state revenue in a non-authorizing school district, you have a negative, basically 1.45%. Now you've seen these numbers before. I'm going to explain. If you times this by 100, you're going to get a percent. If you're looking at it on the screen, you can just move the decimal place 2 spots. So this is for every decrease in state revenues, our non-authorizing school districts see 140% decrease per unit in their unassigned fund balance. Charter school authorizing districts see the opposite effect. When their state revenues go down, per unit, they see a 13.3% increase in their unassigned fund balance. The same is also true in instructional expenses. You'll see the same relationship here. As instructional expenses go up, you'll see a dramatic effect on non-authorizing school districts, where the effect on charter schools is much less. This also continues down into our diversity statistics. You can see that in the free lunch program. Free lunch program has almost no effect. Even though there's a very significant correlation there, there's a very small effect on fund balance. So charter school districts without charter schools are able to better cope with diversity than those with. As you can see in charter schools, we have a significant impact upon how much money they are able to save. We see similar things in the committed fund balance. Again, state revenue has significance, and again, it is in an opposite relationship. Instructional expenses, again, very significant, and again, opposite relationships. And as we go to the assigned fund balance, again, we're seeing the same relationships, and we're seeing the same kind of connection here. State revenue is significant for both, with opposite reactions. Federal revenue is significant, with opposite reactions. And free lunch program is significant, with opposite reactions. These are all significant and all important because they point to the difference between a charter authorizing school district and a non-authorizing charter school district and their ability to save. From this, we have a couple conclusions. When more state revenues are diverted to charters, the authorizing district saves more. When state revenues to non-authorizing districts increase, their fiscal savings go down. When local revenues increase, districts without charter competition save less. As instructional costs increase in charters, districts' savings decline. However, in instructional costs increase in non-authorizing districts, their savings increase. As diversity increases in charter districts, their savings decline, but this relationship does not occur in non-authorizing districts. And as the population with free lunch subsidy increases, district savings increase in both types of districts. From this, we can make a couple of recommendations on ways to go forward. We'd like to increase the transparency within school budgeting. What this means is we'd actually like to see charter schools create a budget at the beginning of the year, which they are not required to do and largely do not do at this point in time. This would help us better understand instructional and administrative costs in the charter schools, because now we would have a budget that would capture those figures. The next thing we'd like to do is we'd like to see charter schools change from their funding, which uses a mean-based per student costing, to something a little more complex that takes into account where those districts are located. Why we want this change is because this has been pointed to as, in previous research, as a large point of why most charter schools build in impoverished neighborhoods. Because the school districts that have those impoverished neighborhoods have a higher per cost mean of students, meaning each student costs more to educate in that district. So the charter schools, when they move to that district, they get more money. So what are our next steps for? We'd like to present our research at a conference. We want to do this so that we can get feedback, of course. We'd also like to refine our model. We want to try different operationalization of the variables. We'd also like to try a multi-level regression model to address some of our data nesting. What this means is that some of the schools are nested within districts, which requires us to use hierarchical logical linear models. Dr. Theo will explain this later. We'd also like to better understand the demographic findings. Some of our demographics findings were significant, but you saw a significant change, sometimes as much as 2,500% change. And that's a large change for a demographic variable to have on a school district. So we'd like to better understand that, see if there's not an underlying cause there.
Thank you, Aaron. So now let's open up the Q&A, and maybe we can have all presenters up here. We can have Kevin and Son come up here. Beth, you stay down there. And if you have any questions for our presenters, please hit them. Let's start with Sidney. Sidney, go ahead.
I apologize, I know you went over this, but can you remind me what the difference is between the brick and mortar and the regional charters?
So a brick and mortar is authorized by a single school district, and a regional is a group of school districts who authorize it. So they're both physical buildings, but they differ in who sets it up. Yeah.
Let's hear from FJ.
Yeah, how come they're not
So far, it's just the way that it's been accounted for. It's been up to the school districts, and most of the legislation has come down on the school districts to police the charter schools. And what we're seeing is that's not really happening.
And this is, I mean, this is an excellent question, and it's very strange that charter schools are not responsible for putting together their own budgets. But this is how it is across all the U.S. In most states, charter schools are not putting together the budgets. They allow their school districts to do all the calculations for them. Now, from the presentations that you saw, there's a few things that they really jump out. Now, one of the things that jumps out is, if you remember, the big effect of free and reduced lunch, which is a proxy variable for measuring low income within districts, and the effect that it had on with the fund balance of the school districts that they authorized charter schools, right? So what this tells you is that charter schools are picking and targeting specific areas that they go and open their schools. And the way the budget is done, again, in Pennsylvania as well as in most other states, gives the opportunity to charter schools to go and pick areas that they can make sure that they will get a lot higher revenues out of them. Now, you look here in Pennsylvania, we have 500 school districts. Only 39 school districts within Pennsylvania are the ones who allow charter schools to operate within their district. Most charter schools in Pennsylvania operate within Philadelphia, where we know that the Philadelphia School District has a lot of issues, and there is a lot of areas within Philadelphia with low-income families, low-income students, and so on, as well as Pittsburgh and the Allegheny County. Same kind of issue. So to us, when we look at the data and the results, and we compare, if you want, the effects within authorizers and non-authorizers, it is extremely clear, it is very visible that charter schools are targeting specific areas where they can make sure they're going to get most money for the students that they attract, right? So to your question, but we agree it is very, very strange for having the school district to do the calculations for the charters. And this is, I think, something that we need to push the Pennsylvania politicians to change in the way of calculating the funds for the school districts. We're lucky to have Sean here with us that represents us up in Harrisburg. And maybe this is an issue that we can take up there and push politicians to change it. I think that by giving a little bit more responsibility to charter schools of coming up with their own budget, that can save a lot of money out of taxpayers. Charter schools know a lot better their needs than their school district. Any other questions? Let's hear from Belinda. You or Kevin?
So they have technology expenses. Each student would be given a laptop to access the programming, and the teachers still report to, I guess, the administration building of a cyber school. And I actually got to tour one last year as part of my job. And it's interesting because it's kind of like walking in an office and the teachers have their headset and they're communicating with they're filming themselves giving a web lecture that students can watch live or tune in, and they grade papers. So the education cost for a teacher is still probably the largest expense, administration and then technology. But they don't have the same building expenses as the largest difference.
Let's hear from Max.
I think to add to that, I'm pretty familiar with learning on the go as part of what our company does, and the average cost per hour of educational recording is about $1,700, whether it's this equipment to do it or the research that goes into it. So they say on average about an hour of recording for educational purposes is about $1,700. So I don't know how much of it is live versus recording, but.
And Belinda, to your question, there is a couple of other things with the charter framework versus the school district framework. So as Beth said at the beginning, charters came into existence in order to compete with public schools and create a little bit more competition. The idea, of course, when we talk about economics and competition is that competition, when it increases, it improves the product. while it drives down price, right, the cost of the product. Now, what the problem is here is that in Pennsylvania and many other states, charter schools have been given a lot more flexibility in how to produce and deliver the product of education, which of course, gives them an advantage. But at the same time, a lot of school districts, public schools, are not given this same flexibility. So now, obviously, here charter schools have a bigger advantage in how to deliver a product when they compare them with public schools. Now, when we talk about competition, we want to say competition among equal parts, equal, if you want, actors. So another thing that I believe it's important at this point for the state to consider is to also allow the school districts to allow them to do similar things as charter schools do. Cyber charters that put together online courses, maybe school districts can do the same, put their own online courses. And that could also help them out perhaps to keep enrollment within the school district and not lose students to cybers or other charters who have the ability to do more with the public resources, if we want it this way. Scott?
Privatizing education, don't you think it's getting more out of whack anymore with the cost of special needs and behavioral students? They don't go to these schools, so don't you see the cost to deliver the services to those children?
Does any of you want to take this question? So do you mean that special needs students do not go to charters? As compared to school districts, to public schools?
There are actually some charters that their model is based for special education students, so that's the only type of student they take. But when we looked at the demographic variables, the concentration of special ed students was actually pretty similar. So I don't think there's much of an imbalance between the amount of special ed kids. The way the funding works from that, there creates some disparities and actually incentivizes charter schools to try and get more special education students that are in the lower cost category, maybe say they only require one service per week rather than a full-time aide. But charter schools are still public schools, and they're required to provide an education for anyone who has that individualized education plan. So they can't turn away a special education student or not provide the services if that student chooses to go there.
And Scott and everyone else, remember that charter schools are created many times because of the initiatives that parents within a district take. So a group of parents, perhaps they are dissatisfied with the product that the school district or the public school in their district is offering. All they have to do is simply gather signatures, and then they can propose the creation of a charter. From personal research, I have also seen that specific groups of students, such as special needs students, when they move from the public schools to charters, they do cost a lot more to the state and the taxpayers. Charters, again, they have the ability to charge a lot more for the same or similar services that they offer with public schools. So again, to me and the research that I've done, and now with all the students, it is clear that charter schools are targeting for specific groups of students in specific areas where they can maximize the resources that they get out of the state, out of the public taxpayers. Let's hear from Bridget. Bridget, go ahead.
So I was always under the impression that there are a lot of different types of charter schools. So they could be targeting certain populations based on their mission.
Mm-hmm.
So didn't Microsoft create a school in Philadelphia that was focused on technology and science?
Mm-hmm.
So their budget might be very different from another type of charter school. So is that part of your study, or perhaps like potential something down the line to start breaking them up into different types? Because obviously their budgets and their needs and the variables are going to be very different.
Sean and Kevin, they did break them down in the existent groups, or perhaps maybe I should allow you to talk about your research, not me. Sorry. I just get super excited.
I think it's just the types, right?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question to create another dummy variable for whether they have a specialized, such as, there's some of them in the title you can tell, like the Charter School for Environmental Studies of Philadelphia, music and arts. Yeah, so we did not look at that, but I think that's an interesting concept.
And I was also thinking of corporations
Valerie. Valerie, go ahead.
So I just had a comment rather than a question based on something you said, Leo. You mentioned that not teachers, but parents in a community, they could just get together and gather signatures to, get a charter school started in their area. Well, at the foundation that I worked for, when I was in Florida, we focused on public education in Duval County, Florida. And we paid attention to charters. I mean, it was one of the states where I think it showed 10% of the students there in charter schools. And what we learned is that in some states, that it might not necessarily be parents going around and collecting those signatures, but the charter school, like companies or entities themselves, going around and sort of posing as community members to gather the necessary signatures to get a charter school. And so I just wanted to add that comment.
Fantastic. Thank you. I knew we should call for a paper together, Valerie.
Valerie is my wife, but she doesn't want to do any of this job. She hardly even believes that people like the things that I teach. But they do, you see.
I had to come to see.
Let's see, I think we have a couple of more questions here. Let's hear from Pete, and then I'll go to Belinda, and then we have Stefan as well. Pete, go ahead.
So how much did you at all focus on Philadelphia, like, with the challenges that Philadelphia's had? Specifically, you have, a congressman and his son in jail related to a charter school. Like, there's been like a significant amount of corruption in the charter school deal. Like, how much of that did you see in some of your research just by looking at such a large population? I mean, there's been like just straight illegitimate charter schools that were like money-making enterprises too.
Yeah, when we looked at the data that we had with respect to charter schools, if it was inconsistent across the board, or if there were some areas that were deficient or missing, we tried to make sure that our data was standard and equal across the board, that all the categories were filled in, whether it be a zero or not, that they had some reported amount in there. So I can only naturally assume that those ones that were involved in corruption, that were missing some major components, since all their variables and all the data or financial reports that they were probably submitting were not legitimate. So I can assume that a good portion of that was probably missing some data, which we knocked out of our study. I can't say for certain how many of those there were, or whether or not the ones that we did collect did fall into that category. We didn't necessarily look at that when we initially went through it. Certainly something we can look at down the road.
Going back to our descriptive statistics, one of the things I pointed out was the discrepancy between administration costs, and that could account for some of that corruption. And it's also one of the reasons we are advocating for a budget to be created through the charter schools, because that will help eliminate a lot of the corruption that can exist.
Is there just one last question? Is there a governing board in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that adjudicates and supervises?
Actually, it was like 2 years ago, PD created a new division of charter schools, which it used to be nested in some other division. So it's grown so far as to warrant its own office. But there's also a board called the Charter Appeals Board, and they handle any complaints between payments between charters and school districts. And PD monitors the financials the same as they do charter schools in terms of what has to be reported to them.
Let's hear from Dr. Perrin. Stefan, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I think I have two questions.
Yes.
My first one might be for Beth, actually, which is I was wondering how, what the criteria were to identify Pennsylvania's 41st out of 43 or something like that in terms of charter school performance. Can you put some flesh on those bones?
Not too well, but I can tell you that the name of the study was measuring up. So they had a whole set of standards, and they were measuring 44 states against a long set of standards. So I can't give you too much more than that, other than that was a national study by a national advocacy group.
Okay, so that's going to be standardized testing, not funding. And then my second one is so we could discuss hierarchical linear modeling. Specifically, as I was looking at the last research project, I couldn't help but wonder to what extent the observations of the impact on the fund balance was just a matter of the wealth of the district, particularly since these charter schools are predominantly located in these lower SES communities. And so that it might in fact not have the impact that was observed, right? Or that it might, but it's not significant. It's just a case that there's no money there. You know what I mean? To put in these funds, particularly the unassigned fund balance.
I know when we first started looking at the research, that was a question I raised myself. In particular, I was looking at the difference between rural and urban districts because there is that disparity, especially in Pennsylvania, because you'll see a lot of the school districts surrounding, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh are relatively wealthy in comparison per capita. We didn't get a chance to delve into that, but I think you could be correct in that assumption.
And I think I'm not sure if that was 100% clear from the presentation that Aaron gave. But what Aaron was doing was looking at the school districts that they do not have any charter schools within them, and then school districts that they do have charters. And he was looking at how charters affect, right, the fund balance of the school districts. Obviously, as we have said earlier, it seems that charter schools are picking the areas that they go to. We think that they pick in the low-income areas because low-income areas offering education to low-income students cost more than offering education to like high-income students. And at the same time, low-income areas, they do get a lot of like funding that comes automatically in a formula, sort of like format, either from the federal or the state government. And one of the things I think that it's happening here, based on the results, is that charter schools, they do sort of like, I wouldn't say steal, but they do like limit the amount of money that school districts get. So in a sense, school districts lose money to charter schools because money is diverted to the charters.
I would agree, but I'm sitting here with a rival hypothesis in my mind, which is that without a control, if there weren't charter schools, if there weren't any charter schools or it wasn't an authorizing district, they may still not have an unassigned balance.
Sure, absolutely.
You see what I'm saying? So
Absolutely.
That would be my only sort of concern about the research, is that if you're going to make this, if you were to make a claim that suggested a policy change in Harrisburg, for example, we'd want to be clear that it's actually the charter school doing it.
Sure.
Particularly since some of the other research, it suggests that it doesn't have, maybe the negative impact. Anyway.
No, I think that's absolutely, that's a great question. I mean, when we work with modeling, as we have said, with statistics, we want to be sure, okay, that we are speaking the truth, right, and that we have as valid results as we can. So your comment is very important, and you need to take a note of that. No, because I can't remember of everything, okay?
Me and Beth have had this discussion.
And since Valerie was nice enough to extend the discussion beyond just questions, and we're allowed to offer comments.
Sure.
I was really surprised that the cyber charters, the racial, the non-white,
the ethnic diversity?
The ethnic
Yes.
diversity is like 33%. So we're assuming then, I mean, my takeaway was that it's white, wealthy, suburban kids that are using these cyber schools.
I am not sure exactly. I don't know if you guys.
I can speak anecdotally about this from previous work. My previous work as a police officer was in Anacostia, Washington, D.C., which is very impoverished. And what we saw is we did see a lot of cyber enrollment, and it came down to one thing: transportation. If your kid can stay at home where you can watch them, you don't have to pay daycare expenses, you don't have to work 2 jobs to pay for a car, and they can still get the education.
And let's take a few more questions. I'll take Rolling. Rolling, go ahead.
So I don't really know much about charters, but the one fact that stuck out to me, that there's charters in 44 states. Is there a reason that the other 6 states that are not present?
That is a great question, and I can tell you that from year to year there is a lot more support for like states to put together charters. I know that one of the states that was added lately was Alabama, I think within the past year or a couple of years ago, they came up with some sort of, I think it's a lot of it has to do with legislation and support. So I think if the state has support, right, from politicians and their voters in order to create this competition between public schools and charters, it's going to happen. Another thing I want to say, it's obvious right now with the current administration that we have at the federal level, we are pro-charter. We have become a pro-charter country. So I think this is going to become a lot more intense in the next few years as before. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the next few years you see like all states having like some sort of like charter school law on that. And with that, let's give another hand to our presenters. Thank you very much. And let's move on now let's switch gears. And from Pennsylvania, we'll go into the rest of the world. So now the next set of presentations that we have here, they also take another research area that I am very interested and have published on. It's on the area of fiscal transparency. And for those of you who have taken my course, Financial Management, or those who are planning to take my course, we do talk a lot about fiscal transparency, about accountability. Fiscal transparency is a very important aspect of governance. And this kind of research looks into almost 60 countries around the world from every part of the globe. And we are trying to identify with this research what are the factors that may increase fiscal transparency. What kind of like factors can help countries to become more fiscally transparent? First, we'll start with an introduction prepared by Sidney Camisa. A couple of things about Sidney. Let me here find my notes. So Sidney was born in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, but she grew up in Clinton, New Jersey. We do not know why, and we do not want to ask. I don't know if Clinton is better than Bethlehem. I'm not sure. I'm not going to ask. She graduated from the University of Vermont with a bachelor's in gender, sexuality, and women's study, and a minor in French. I wish I knew that earlier. I could have spoken a little bit of French. After graduation, she completed 2 years of AmeriCorps and worked for a local rape crisis center. She then moved to Philly, spent another 2 years in a case management position at a disability rights nonprofit organization. While here at the MPA program, she began interning at the Pennsylvania Ballet. She was actually at the development department, and after her great work and the things that she learned in our program, she was able to excel herself within this organization, and she is now the Associate of Special Events and Institutional Giving. One of the things that she does, and I find it super interesting, she digs into like data and trying to figure out how to make people give more money to the Pennsylvania Ballet. So I hope that we are able to help you out to get more money. And another important thing here is that Sidney graduates in spring 2019. So let's all welcome Sidney for her introduction on fiscal transparency. And after Sidney, we're going to have 2 more presentations, and our program will be done for tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Rappis. That was a
Here
very nice
you go.
introduction. So I'm going to be talking about fiscal transparency and introducing our 2 projects, mine and Ann's, and Tolu and Max's. So just to start off, fiscal transparency, there's not really one set definition. And it wasn't really until the 60s and 70s that it even started to be really conceptually discussed a lot. It has its origins in both political theory and institutional economics, looking at how rules can help the public monitor fiscal conditions in their country, and also how to reduce the power gap between principals, which are constituents and agents who are elected representatives. So the IMF, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, is the International Monetary Fund, and they describe fiscal transparency as comprehensiveness, clarity, reliability, timeliness, and relevance of public reporting on the past, present, and future state of public finances. And overall, kind of the broader view of fiscal transparency is that a government and country's fiscal information should be available, accurate, reliable, and accessible. The accessible part, I think, is maybe the most important, because if you just throw a bunch of information out there, people aren't necessarily going to be able to comprehend and see what it's telling you about the state of the economy. So why is fiscal transparency important? It seems to me it's fairly common sense, and there's also a lot of reasons why. The kind of things that come to the top of our minds for this are that it removes kind of a shroud of secrecy between the government and the constituents and helps constituents better understand what's going on with the economy. It also increases fiscal accountability and civic participation and makes for better government decision-making, which then leads to improving financial performance, and overall, just increasing surveillance can lead to more responsible decision-making. The three organizations that have really been the most outspoken and prominent about promoting fiscal transparency are IMF, the International Monetary Fund that came up earlier, the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the IBP, which is the International Budget Partnership. So IMF came about in 1945, and it currently comprises information and partnerships between 189 different countries. This organization focuses overall on the monetary system around the world. In 1998, I believe, they came up with a set of codes for best practices for fiscal transparency. And in 1999, they started offering these reports on observance and standards and codes. And they have not, in my opinion, been that impactful. And that's because they don't just kind of periodically check in on all the countries. A country has to come to the organization and say, can you run this report and tell us how we're meeting your code and standards? And so I think like since 2011, there's maybe been a handful of countries that have approached them and asked for these reports. So they, realizing that there were some issues going on with fully pushing fiscal transparency to the top of the agenda around the world, I believe in the past 10 years made a call for additional research, which is part of why Dr. Arapis has focused on this in his research. The OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, came around in the early 60s and currently comprises 36 countries. They focus primarily on democracies, so that's a little bit limiting, but their focus overall is on policies and specifically looking at economic, social, and environmental conditions around the world. They also have a set of reporting standards, which are known as the best practices for budget transparency. And again, that's kind of tailored to democracies. IBP, the International Budget Partnership, was established in 1997 and currently has a consortium of about 100 plus countries. We focused a lot on this organization because we really like the OBI, the Open Budget Index, that they use to cross-nationally examine fiscal transparency around the globe. And their focus, pretty similarly, is transparency and inclusivity in government budget process. So most of the past research on fiscal transparency has been very focused on transparency as the independent variable, which looks at how transparency impacts other components of a country's government and economic status. And it has also largely been cross-sectional, which means that it's only focusing on one moment in time. So in 2017, Dr. Arapis and Vincent Rayetano produced a study which focused on transparency as the dependent variable. So it kind of switched the norm for what had been looked at and looked at how other factors impact the transparency level of a country. It's also remarkable because it's not cross-sectional, it's longitudinal, so it examined data from 2006 to 2012, and our two sets of studies kind of picked up where Dr. Arapis had left off and extended the years a little bit farther by looking at 2006 through 2015. And we, like Dr. Arapis had mentioned, focus on 59 countries. So the dependent variable, like I mentioned, the OBI, the Open Budget Index, overall, we thought that this was a really good measure of transparency because it is independent, which means that they don't need to interact directly with the government to gather this information. It's also all gathered at the same time, so you're not looking at snapshots of just different periods and areas all over the place. It's more uniform, and it draws from multiple sources within a country for their data. They primarily focus on their index on 8 different key budget documents that they believe a country should have, and they focus a lot on the quantity and timeliness of a government releasing this information to the public, and just general what they believe to be international good practice standards. So they conduct this study every 2 years, and you can see at the bottom their ranges for what is, good, medium, and bad. The United States has a score of 77 in the most recent study, which is 2017. And so that doesn't put us up in the top tier, but, we're pretty close to the top. There's still some work that we could do. And we're going to take a look at the top 5 and bottom 5 countries. This is pretty interesting to me because if you look at the numbers, no one's cracking 90, and it's a scale of 0 to 100. The top country, New Zealand, only has a score of 89. And there's, these 5 countries have a score of 0. I think there was a 6th country that also scored 0, which is kind of concerning. I would be interested to see how we could move those countries up to get over 90. I'm going to talk now about our independent variables throughout the 2 different studies that we pulled from. So democracy was a pretty big one in that we pulled from the Economist Intelligence Unit, which took 5 different measures of democracy and created an index for 167 countries, ranking them. We used the World Bank for a lot of our sources of data, especially for the independent variables, and political competition was one of those, which looks at the percentage of seats which the party currently in charge holds in Parliament. So you would, a preferable number would actually be lower because good political competition would mean that there were fewer seats held by the party that's currently in charge. It's also of note that we divided our variables into 3 different areas, which was political conditions, fiscal conditions, and information access. So next we're going to be talking about fiscal conditions, and all of these came from the World Bank. So all these came from the World Bank. The World Bank, just to give you some general information, has 189 countries in its membership, and it comprises 5 different institutes who provide both funding and research and data on developing and developed countries around the world. And they just have a really strong, open and available data bank on transparency and finances of a lot of different countries. So we looked at gross domestic product, gross national income, GDP growth, which was annually, and current account balance. Those were all just in just straight dollars, what these countries had in their accounts for all of those. The next 2 independent variables, general government total expenditures and general government gross debt, we looked at as percentages of the gross domestic product. Net development assistance, that was just straight cash. And then mineral depletion, we looked at as a percentage of the gross national income, and oil rents is a percentage of GDP also. So the last 3 pieces of independent variables that we looked at were related to information access. So we looked at what freedom of information laws countries had on the books, and we pulled from the Center for Law and Democracy for that, and they have a freedom of information index based around a country's laws. Internet use, we again pulled from the World Bank, and that's just the percentage of the population that has ready access to the internet. For legal origin, we pulled from the CIA database and coded countries based on whether they were common or civil law. And the difference between common and civil law is that common law is based off of case law, so published judiciary opinions. So the United States, New Zealand, Canada, England, those are all examples of common law countries. Civil law focuses more on codified statutes, and some examples are Japan, Iran, China, Germany, France, Spain. I think common law is based off of British law, and civil law is based off of French law. And lastly, these are the 2 studies that our groups pulled out of all of this information. So Anne and I focused on democracy and fiscal transparency, and Max and Tolu focused on developed and developing countries and fiscal transparency. Thank you.
So next up, we have Anne Riddle. Anne worked with Sidney together on looking at factors that may influence fiscal transparency within democracies and autocracies. A couple of words about Anne. She grew up in Mayfield, Ohio. After graduating from Hiram College, she started her political science master's here at Villanova University. At the same time, she was enrolled to get a certificate in the nonprofit management. And this is something that within the 6 years that I've been at Villanova, it's becoming more than just a coincidence. We win students from the political science department, and then they enroll to our MPA. She graduates this semester from the political science department with her master's, and she has just started her MPA here. But as I said, she has already taken a few courses on nonprofit management. So it seems that she has like an advantage here. So let's welcome Anne. While you're getting wired up.
Thank you.
Here.
Thank you, Dr. Rappes, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming here today. I'm Ann Riddle, and I worked with Sidney on presenting, on researching how the type of government impacts fiscal transparency. So these are our initial results. Future research will work on improving these results, but we're pretty confident in what we're presenting today, and of course we're open to any suggestions or comments, and we welcome that. So our research question was, how does democracy impact the government's fiscal transparency? And as Sidney talked about just a little bit ago, fiscal transparency, it's not one size fits all. There is no one perfect way for a government to be fiscally transparent, but there are a number of other ways that they can be more open to their citizens and honest with their citizens. So Sidney talked about the variables that both teams were using for their research, so I'm just going to talk about our hypotheses. So we used the Open Budget Index as our dependent variable, which is the best measure of fiscal transparency. But for independent variables, so looking at democracy, based on our literature review, we hypothesized that the degree of a country's democracy is associated with lower levels of fiscal transparency. Now, this hypothesis expects a negative relationship between democracy and fiscal transparency. So as democracy increases, fiscal transparency will decrease, and vice versa. Now, we expected the same relationship, a negative relationship, for political competition. Moving on to our fiscal conditions, for gross domestic product, we hypothesized a positive relationship. So as gross domestic product increases, transparency also increases at the same time. And this is also true if gross domestic product decreases, transparency will also decrease. So our hypothesis for the gross national income was the same. It was a positive hypothesis. We hypothesized that there would be a negative relationship between GDP growth. Now, when we got to current account balance, you can see there's plus and a minus sign, which means that we did not specify a relationship. So we just said that we hypothesized there would be a relationship between the fiscal transparency and current account balance. And you can see this indicated with the positive and minus sign. So moving on to general government total expenditures, we expected a positive relationship with that. We did not specify a direction for general government gross debt, and we specified a positive relationship for net development assistance with fiscal transparency. Now, previous academic research produced conflicting results for both mineral depletion and oil rents, so we did not specify a relationship for either of those variables with fiscal transparency. With information access, we expected a positive relationship. For internet use, we did not specify a direction, and for legal origin, we expected a positive relationship with fiscal transparency. So moving on to our research methods, again, our sample was 59 countries. We collected data for these countries looking at our dependent and independent variables from 2006, 2008, 2010, 2012, and 2015. Through working with Dr. Rappis, we found that pooled ordinary least squares regression was the best model. And we lagged our independent variables to ensure that our model was actually intending what it was hoping to measure. Now, doing so addressed issues, as the other teams talked about, of endogeneity, where the dependent variable is influencing the independent variable, not just the independent variable influencing the dependent variable. An example of this would be if a country wants to issue more debt, they'd have to be more fiscally transparent in order to do so to attract investors. But at the same time, a high OBI, a high fiscal transparency, can also influence whether a country is able to get investors for their debt. So lagging the independent variables also helped with issues of autocorrelation when errors are correlated with each other. We found problems with heteroscedasticity, say that 10 times fast, which means that the variance of errors are not equal across the range. And so we added in robust standard errors to correct for that. And then lastly, the variance inflation factor showed that there was no multicollinarity, and that refers to when the independent variables are highly correlated with each other. So you can see on the PowerPoint our equation expressed in the formula format. So we have groups of variables. So we have the 3 sets of independent variables: information access, political competition, and fiscal factors. And these are vectors of variables grouped together to measure those effects. And you can also see that at the end, we're lagging the independent variables by 1 year. You can see our time effects and standard error. So now looking into some descriptive statistics, these tables look at democracy and autocracy and provide some descriptive statistics on those two. So we can see that political competition, there's more political competition for democracies than autocracies, which makes sense if you think about the nature of these types of government. When we look at current accounts balance, we can see that it is less current account balance for democracies compared to autocracies. And then that makes sense once we look at the gross debt. We can see that democracies have higher levels of debt than autocracies do. When we're looking at these descriptive statistics, we also see that government total expenditures are higher for democracies than they are for autocracies. And when we look at mineral depletion, we can see that autocracies are depleting their resources faster than democracies are. And relatedly, with oil rents, we can see that autocracies depend on oil for their GDP at a much higher amount than democracies do. And then finally, this table shows us that democracies have greater access. Their citizens have greater access to the internet and use it more than autocracies. So into some descriptive statistics specifically for the OBI. When we're looking at the OBI at first, we can see that the median for all years is higher for democracies than it is for autocracies. But once we do a year-by-year analysis of the median, we find some interesting results. So democracy, we see it was 78.5 in 2006, but it greatly decreased when it was 2008. And even though it's continued increasing from 2008 to 2010 to 2012, they didn't go back to their 2006 levels until 2015. Now, we see the opposite effect for autocracies, they start very low in 2006, but then they greatly increase in 2008. They continue increasing until 2015, where they again greatly decrease. Now, our interpretation of these results for democracies is that because of the recession, citizens were upset with their leaders and their government for the state of the economy. And so when they were expressing this annoyance, this outrage with the state of the economy, the political leaders closed some of the avenues for fiscal transparency because they didn't want to be as open to the citizens. So that's our interpretation for this decrease initially. Now for autocracies, if you think back to the recession, if you remember, gas prices were pretty high. So our interpretation of that is that the autocracies depended more on their natural resources, so their minerals, their oil, and as such, it increased their current account balance, and that has a strong positive relationship with fiscal transparency, as I'll get to in a couple slides. But our interpretation is that because the autocracies were doing better than other governments, other countries, they wanted to share that information with their citizens, and so that's why there's that increase in fiscal transparency. So we here have a couple graphs just showing what I was talking about. So overall, OBI tends to have it tends to be increasing except for a little dip from 2010 to 2012. And again, this graph represents what I was just talking about with democracies and autocracies, how democracies dipped down while autocracies went up during those years. So now we're getting into the pooled panel data. So this one is for democracies. And we can see from the F statistic that our results were significant for this table. So we find that political competition, and we find that oil rents were significant for democracies. So for political competition, we can see that there is a positive relationship. So as political competition increases, fiscal transparency increases as well. Now, we had hypothesized that there would be a negative relationship, but instead we found a positive one. Now, the interesting part about political competition's coefficient is that it's very high. And so for every unit increase in political competition, there is an increase in fiscal transparency. Now, with oil rents, we found a positive relationship as well. We did not hypothesize a direction for this. But as you can see, there are two others that are bolded. We found that government total expenditures and internet use were marginally significant. So for government total expenditures, we can see that there's a negative relationship. So as it increases, fiscal transparency decreases. And for internet use, there is a positive relationship. So again, as internet use and access increases, fiscal transparency also increases. Now, we found it particularly interesting that the Freedom of Information Act variable was not significant. So when these countries have laws that say that they're going to be fiscally transparent and open and their citizens have rights to open government, it's not having an impact in democracies on fiscal transparency. It's not having a direct impact. So moving on to autocracies now. This is the pool panel data for autocracies. And again, this table has significant results from the F statistic. Now, we can see that government gross debt, current account balance, mineral depletion, and oil rents were all statistically significant. We can see that current account balance was very statistically significant. So almost all of these variables have a negative relationship except for current account balance, which has a positive relationship. And when we're looking at the current account model, we can also see that there's a very high coefficient for that as well. Now, oil and mineral depletion are valuable incomes for autocracy, but it's interesting that they have negative relationships with fiscal transparency. So that's pretty interesting that their account balance is positive, but their mineral depletion and their oil rents are negative on fiscal transparency. So again, this model showed that the Freedom of Information Act was not significant. Again, this is surprising. Originally, we thought maybe this was just something that occurred in democracies, but also in autocracies, we're finding that having laws on the books that ensure fiscal transparency, it's not having a direct input, a statistically significant direct impact on fiscal transparency. And so perhaps this is something that our political leaders and our public administrators should think about, if this is having effects in other areas or if it's just simply not having any effect at all. Now, Dr. Rappis's research on oil rents and mineral depletion indicated that there were two variables. These were two variables, mineral depletion and oil rents, and that they would have negative relationships with fiscal transparency. And we can see that in autocracies this is true. However, in democracies, oil rents has a positive relationship, which transitions into our conclusions. So we found that what works well in democratic countries with fiscal transparency does not work the same for autocratic countries. So there were significant variables for democracies, and they weren't significant for autocracies. So democracies had political competition, government total expenditures, internet use, and oil rents were all significant variables. Whereas in autocracies, government gross debt, current account balance, mineral depletion, and oil rents were statistically significant for fiscal transparency in autocracies. So the only variable that these two types of government shared that was significant for both was oil rents. However, there was a positive relationship with democracies and a negative one with autocracies. So this means that the IMF, the OECD, other researchers that look at fiscal transparency, they should update how they research this topic, because what influences fiscal transparency in one type of government isn't the same for another type of government, for autocracies. And practically this means that public administrators, political leaders, the strategy they use that are efficient for one type of country differs from what's maybe efficient for another type of country. Now, for our future research, as we know, research is never finished, and so we're striving to improve upon our research. So we'll be delving further into looking at why the OBI is so low during those years for democracies and so high for autocracies during those years. And we want to see if our initial interpretations are held true. We also want to further, we also plan on adding 2017 data to our results. The Open Budget Survey for 2017 came out earlier this year. And it'd be interesting to see if democracy's OBI continues to increase or if it decreases, and if it does decrease, by how much. And similarly for autocracies, it'd be interesting to see if they increase or if they decrease as well, particularly since they dropped from 61 in 2012 all the way to 35 in 2015. Now, we'll also try and improve our regression. We're thinking about adding in fixed effects to see if that can make our model a little bit better. And lastly, since we ran our regression on full democracies and authoritarian regimes, we want to look at the other two OBI measures, the Economist Intelligence Unit, where they have flawed democracies and they have hybrid regimes. We want to run our regressions on those as well. Maybe full democracies and flawed democracies can be treated the same, and hybrid regimes and autocracies can be treated the same, or perhaps all four different government types should be treated differently. So Dr. Rappis, Sidney, and I would like to present our research at a conference. We're thinking about the Budgeting and Financial Management Conference. We're also planning on publishing a paper together, possibly publishing it in the American Review of Public Administration or another equivalent journal. So thank you again for coming to the Research Symposium and listening to our presentation on our work.
Thank you, Anne. And then we'll move on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on into our final presentation for tonight. We have research that was done from Max Crossfits and Tolu Omadara. Unfortunately, Tolu is not here with us. He is somewhere in London for training. So Tolu, if you are there looking at our stream here, hello from everyone. And we hope you have fun in London and wish you safe travels coming back. A couple of things about Max, who's going to lead the first half of the presentation. Then I'll take over to finish up the presentation, wrap up the presentation with the findings. Max grew up in Dolestown. He graduated here from Villanova with a degree in communication, and he was also a soccer player here at Villanova. He played soccer for 4 years here as an offensive, as a striker. In spring 2017, he started his MPA, and he currently works at SAP Americas in the Database and Data Management Department. With that said, let's welcome Max and get him up to the podium. All right, you got it.
All right. Okay, so thank you all for coming. Thank you for my classmates for a great semester. It was fun working with you all and getting the research together. So to start, we're going to be looking at fiscal transparency in developed and developing nations. And like Theo mentioned, Tolu is my counterpart, but she cannot make it tonight, so he'll take over her part. So I want to start with our research question. What factors influence fiscal transparency in countries with different economic statuses? And we're going to be using a lot of the variables that Sidney talked about doing, and she did a great job explaining them, so I won't waste any time and re-going over them. I'll give you a couple reminders as we go. And what we're seeking to find is, so what works in developed countries may not work in developing countries, and that's going to lead us into some of our variables. Similar to what the other group did, we're going to be using OBI because it's the best form of fiscal transparency we know of right now. And then we'll be using the same independent variables broken into the 3 categories. So to start out with the descriptive statistics, I want to first highlight over here. Oh, it doesn't show up. But I want to highlight the OBI index. And so we got a mean for developed and developing countries of 49.6. So what does that mean exactly? Well, as Sidney stated, it's a rating based on 0 to 100 and the country's their transparency efforts. So as a whole, we are about 50% through the way, and we still have work to do. We are going to take it one step further on the next slide, though, and break it up between developed and developing countries to see how that plays out as well. So the degree of democracy right here, it ranges from 0 to 10, and what we found out is overall there is a mean of 6 between developed and developing, which is good, but some improvement could still happen. And then I want to say that Chad is the least democratic country on this scale, and Norway is the most democratic. Okay, so when we took it one step further and we broke it up into developed versus developing countries, we looked at the mean for everything, and we found some interesting facts. So for developed, I want to start with their findings. So they have a higher OBI, which is closer to the 60 that was, or 61 that is considered a good score, and that was from the International Budget Partnership. They said 61 is an appropriate score. So what we found there was that developed countries are doing better than developing. And then I want to go into the degree of democracies. Developed countries are more democratic than developing. They have larger governments, but with the larger governments comes more debt. And now I want to highlight some of the key facts we found for the developing countries. So as Sidney and Ann mentioned, developing countries are more dependent on income from their oil rents and minerals. They also have less internet use, which was expected, but their FOI is lower. So this suggests that there's not as many laws in place for freedom of information. And so on this last slide, I want to talk about this graph. What we did was we took the mean for the OBI year by year, and we compared developed to developing countries. And it started in 2006, so that's when we took the first data points from. And so what this tells us is the developed countries have made more progress over the last 10 years in efforts to become more fiscally transparent. And now for Tolu's part, Dr. Rappis is going to finish this out.
Thank you, Max. I'll go and pick up a couple of things here. First of all, as Max said, obviously developed countries have a larger OBI than the developing. The score that the International Budget Partnership has come up with as a benchmark is 61, as Max said, but I just want to add that 61 means that these countries, they release enough information to their public in order to understand the public budget process. So obviously developed countries are closer to this benchmark. Developing, they need to do a little bit more work. Something that I find surprising when I look at these results is that there is higher political competition within the developing countries than the developed. Earlier, and I think when Anne was presenting her results, there might be something that she said that a lot of you may have like questions. Anne said that democracy has a negative impact on transparency. And that sounds very bizarre. You would expect that democracy would help fiscal transparency to increase. And generally, there is some line of research that has found out this kind of results, a positive relationship between democracy and transparency. There is also another part of research, an emerging part of research that they have found that transparency and democracy have a negative correlation. And my paper that I did a few years ago and published did support this other controversial line of research. So all of us who have found this negative relationship between democracy and transparency, we conclude that democratic countries have the ability to close the doors of fiscal transparency and use, if you want, fiscal transparency to their own advantage. So for example, in governments that they are doing really good, in democratic governments that they're doing really good financially and they have good economic indicators, they want fiscal transparency to flow to the voters. So they want to show the results. But there might be also cases where you have democratic countries with poor economic results. And in that case, they want to protect, right? They want to protect their seats in parliament. And that is when selectively some governments, some democratic governments, select when to release fiscal information and when to close the door. A couple of other things that I find very interesting here is obviously Max made a very good correlation in terms of like developed countries have like a larger government sector. So in developed countries, governments are getting a lot more involved with services, with the economies, the market, and so on. A larger government sector, as Max said, okay, will bring us a higher debt, higher fund balance. But then when looking at the developing countries, and a lot of the developing countries are also autocracies, and referred to that earlier, usually developing countries and autocracies are a lot more dependent upon their natural wealth, mineral depletion or oil. They also receive, the developing countries, they receive external aid, and that is aid that comes out of the IMF, the OECD, and the World Bank. Developed countries receive none help from the IMF, World Bank, and OECD for developing their economies. And then finally, when we look at the acquiring and processing information variables, we can see obviously, and I think that is expected and makes total sense, that in developing countries we have internet use is higher, while a lot lower in developing countries. And also freedom of information in the developing countries is 3 times higher than the developing countries. So let's see here in our research methods. Again, this is the model that we're using. We're using our dependent variable is the OBI, and then we have a vector of political conditions, fiscal conditions, information access, time effects, error, and so on. The methodology is the same as you saw earlier, and kind of follows the paper that I published a few years ago at the American Review of Public Administration. So something that works, you don't really change that in statistics. You hope that it's going to keep working. And then here are some of our regression findings. So again here, for reasons of simplicity, what we did, we are presenting findings for developed on one side and developing countries on the other side. And you can see how interesting the effect is between the one type of country to the other. So you have political competition and negative correlation within the developed countries, positive with the developing. That to me is very interesting. So in developed countries, it seems that when parties are competing, when there is higher competition for who's going to be in government, right, there is less transparency. Perhaps the party who is governing wants to protect their seats on parliament, and they do not release enough information to voters in order to change their vote in the upcoming elections. However, in the developing countries, positive correlation between transparency and political competition. Obviously, perhaps in developing countries, competing parties, they all fight for who's going to get the lead within government. Democracy, again here you see the effect that I was talking earlier, that in developing countries, perhaps governments select the amount of transparency that they release, while in developing countries, a positive correlation, the exact opposite. More democratic countries within the developing world are releasing more information. Fund balance over GDP, it doesn't matter for the developed countries of how good perhaps the economy is in terms of fiscal transparency, perhaps because they already have some mechanisms that automatically they release information to their voters. However, in developing countries, those countries that they have a positive balance, in simple words, a surplus, they want to communicate that to their voters. So they release a lot more information. Mineral depletion is only statistically significant for the developing countries, and it has a negative coefficient. That simply means that as mineral depletion increases, like resources, like revenues coming out of minerals increase, that has a decrease into the OBI, into the fiscal transparency of the country. Looking at the developed countries, you have oil rents, a positive relationship between oil and fiscal transparency. And again, that tells us that, and of course when you compare these with the developing countries, there is no correlation here. The literature generally has focused mostly on autocracies, and the relationship that they have found, as Anne showed us earlier, is that oil rents and transparency, they have a negative relationship, but obviously here it's not the case for developed countries. External aid, that is the most important factor within the developing world of improving their fiscal transparency. You can see here how high the coefficient is. And that makes sense because countries, developing countries that they're seeking support, fiscal support out of big government, non-governmental organizations, global governmental organizations, such as the IMF or the OECD or the World Bank, I assume that they have to release information to these organizations in order to get money back, in order to get assistance. As far as information access, legal origin is the only one that has some sort of effect, that has like a positive effect on fiscal transparency among the developed countries. while for the developing countries, freedom of information, loss of freedom of information, we found that it has a negative effect on fiscal transparency. Now, with that said, the next steps, again, is to add more data into our panel. We want to present this research. I want to present the research with the students, take the students into a conference. This is something that I generally do with the students that I work. I get them to see how fun it is to be in an academic conference where academics like me present stuff. So possible ABFM, the Association of Budget and Financial Management, and then try to publish this research. Obviously, I have committed, and perhaps now that I'm thinking about it, I'm going to have a year with a lot of work with students. But from those who know me, I do love working with students. I'm super stoked and super excited to see the work and the progress that the students did this semester. I did push them a lot beyond my imagination, but I'm so happy of how things turned out and the progress that we did. Students learned not only theory of advanced statistics, they learned how to work with advanced statistical software known as STADA. They came up with a research, of course, with me supervising and inspiring them. They collected an exorbitant amount of data within this semester. They wrote papers. They have paper of about 20 pages plus, and it's still in progress. They were exposed into different kind of regressions. They learned how to do Excel. And I know with Professor Johnson, who is here with me, and also Professor Perrin, we all are working with statistics courses, and I'm sure that pretty soon we will have like some really, really strong courses where we're going to be teaching you a lot of skills that hopefully you're going to find very, very beneficial to your career. With that said, this is it for us from today, but I'll open the Q&A for this group of students for fiscal transparency. So I would like to invite back up Sidney and Max to come here next to me and hear any kind of questions or comments that you might have. So any questions for the students and the research? Let's hear from Danielle.
So I just have a couple of methodological questions.
Absolutely.
As we open up. So first, I'm not understanding the coefficients, right? So you're using OLS. So can you, especially for those coefficients that were particularly significant in each of the studies, I wasn't understanding the scale of the coefficients.
That is a great comment, and we're using a lot of like different metrics within the coefficients. So we might have indexes, we might have ratios, we might have percents. And this is, I think, something because I think you picked on the results and you see that there is a lot of coefficients that are huge with huge standard errors and others that are small. I think the issue here is that we're using a lot of like different kind of like variables that they're measured in different terms. So I think the next part of this is to either standardize. I think standardizing, the variables will give us a little bit of better results than normal coefficients. I have to also double check a little bit of the data that the students have collected, but I'm pretty sure that this is why you see this kind of like very weird fluctuations between, the variables and the coefficients.
Okay, so the outcome variable, it's not all points on the OBI, right? Like on the OBI, that's
the OBI, the fiscal transparency, is a dependent variable.
Yes.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Right, the outcome variable, right?
Yes.
Right, so we're not saying as as you see a unit change in the current account balance, that scale is not going up by 80.
I do not think that this is, again, we have to like go back and look at the data and kind of like normalize the data. Another issue that I picked while I was looking over the results was that there is a few variables in there. For example, account balance over GDP, which is like in the billions, right? And you understand that when you put something that is in the billions within, like a regression model that has like, hundreds, that will pull the coefficient out of like, out of reality. So I think, there is some work to be done on that end for sure. But, very good for picking this up and.
Two more very quick
yes.
questions. The VIF stats on Anne Sidney's report, I wondered if she could speak a little bit, if you also speak a little bit about that, and then if the difference in means test was done
Do you want to take the VIF?
What specifically?
So I was thinking about, again, the dependent variable being an index, in quite a robust one, right? It seems like there's a lot of variables that are included in there. I did notice that a couple of the VIF stats were high
Right.
for the significant variables.
Right. And we're kind of hoping with our playing around with the regressions that that'll help, but it was a lot better with this model than previous models for the VIF. So that's why we were more confident in the multicollinarity results for this.
But also, you know, because I mean, you know, when it comes into multicollinearity, you can pull like different citations and kind of like make your results look better. To my, you know, like weaponry, I have like citations for VIFs that are up to 5. So like below 5, you know, it's considered just fine. And I also have citations that they are up, the benchmark is 10. So it was, you know, I think if I remember correctly, one of them was like 9.01. I mean, and again, you know, it depends on what kind of like, you know, statistical literature you use to support that. I think another, and that's what I did in the paper that I published, because I remember having like issues that with VIF. Instead of lagging, if we use first difference, I think it goes down. So there's a few couple of tricks that we can do with that. As far as the difference of means, we didn't do difference of means. No, we haven't tried that out. But
Is it possible that some are not significant?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you know, obviously there's, you know, some more work that needs to be done here. No, yeah. No, yeah, absolutely. I appreciate your comments. There is work to be done, but to me, the positive thing here is that we have the data. So having the data allows us to play around a lot and see what, you know, holds better in terms of the results. But, you know, your comments are totally appreciated, you know. You picked some good ones. Let's see, Belinda?
So in terms of like minimum transparency, so that wasn't a variable where like democracy, where it's either you're democratic or you're not. That's where the OBI comes in and has the index of 0 to 100 to say on a scale of 100, how transparent are you? So that's where we saw the countries coming in at 0 on that one chart. For them, they were inherently saying there's no transparency there. And I don't know if one of you could speak to more details about like what exactly the OBI measures. We'd have to do some more digging to let you know, but there was a lot of different terms that they used to decide what qualified as transparent or not on the scale. In terms of the internet, I think we actually might have seen that there wasn't a huge correlation between internet use and transparency, which was interesting and kind of went along with the Freedom of Information Act results that we found, where we were expecting a pretty high correlation between the two, and there wasn't. Totally, yeah, absolutely. And that's not something that we really were able to control for at all, unfortunately.
You know, the OBI, as far as the OBI, it's been pulled out, the index is created out of 123 questions. So they look like, you know, at a lot of like different processes into the budget process. And the interesting part with this kind of like index is that they look in the different stages of the budget process. So they have questions when the politicians negotiate with each other. They have questions when they allow for feedback from, you know, the citizens to come in. Then they also have questions of fiscal transparency when the proposals are becoming laws. Let's put it this way, or policies become laws. So it's like a very, very robust type of measure. As far as the internet, you know, in the literature, and I think, you know, this is very true even in this country and into our, like, you know, like personal lives. Do we really use the internet for checking our government? Not really sure about that. So what I'm saying is that even if a country has like very, very open, right, internet access, what it really matters is also education level. So maybe, you know, we need to enrich our model with variables that measure the education level, financial literacy, and so on. So for example, you know, a country might be very open with fiscal information, have everything online, have like a great internet, you know, system,
But if the excuse me, not students, if the citizens, if the citizens do not really understand, right, financial information of how to acquire and how to analyze it, internet is not going to have an impact. And I think this is what is happening here. What is happening is that we are using the internet perhaps for different reasons, not for taking necessarily financial information of our governments. I don't want to ask you to raise hands to see how many of you use the internet to check, like balances. It's because you took my class, that's why,
Sure. But I think, like your comment about censorship is also very, very good comment. Perhaps we need to also look and add into our, like model some sort of like, censorship measurement, see how free or not free the internet is. Let's hear from Nick. Nick?
I think kind of to a similar point, my question was, how did you guys arrive at comparing democracies versus autocracies? Because as you were beginning, my mind initially went to what Max Tolo's work was, developing versus non-developing. There's a lot of similarities in some of the species, but they're still different. And a little bit further, would you possibly be able to go a little bit deeper into those two definitions to look at even the actual government structure, monarchy and so on? Kind of how did you arrive at that, and then what are some possible ways to expand it?
So our research was an expansion of Dr. Rappis's research from 2017, and he had found indications that democracy had a negative relationship with transparency. And so we were further looking at that. So we wanted to look at democracy and then look at the other extreme, at autocracy. So the Economist's Intelligence Unit, they have a scale of 0 to 10, if I'm remembering correctly, 0 to 10, and they have the full democracies at one end and then the autocracies at the other. So we wanted to measure the two different extremes. As to your second question, I think it can be answered. So we have the full democracy, flawed democracy, hybrid regime, and we have the authoritarian government. So we found that the economists, their index was one of the better measures for looking at a country's democracy and what type of regime they are. So I think it would be safe to say we're more dependent on their research and how they classify. So perhaps we could look for something else to measure monarchies and things like that. But for them, we're dependent upon full democracy, flawed democracy, hybrid regime, and authoritarian.
I think also just as a note for the question about why we chose democracy as a topic, there was quite a few studies available that had found not quite a few, but a handful of studies that had found connections between democracy and transparency. And then Dr. Rappa's study had come along and maybe one or two others that had found the opposite to be true. So we also just thought it would be interesting to look more into that and see where our research ended up on that continuum.
And even within a singular government, like looking at our own, we've come a very long way and ebbed and flowed over time as to how democratic we truly are. And so I'm wondering if there's a better dichotomy that would maybe cap or control for those kind of human fluctuations over time.
So maybe that's something as a suggestion for future research, that future research can build upon our paper, our differences between treating democracies differently than autocracies in our research, and they can then break it down within democracies to see the type of democracy that a country has.
Absolutely. Yeah. Fantastic. Okay. Let's hear from Rolling.
I was not really familiar. What's an oil rent? That's the question I have.
So oil rents is, actually, you know what? I'm going to hand it to you for this one.
In simple terms, it's like revenue that's coming out of like selling oil.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. You're welcome. Nick.
Kind of a follow-up, would a number below 1 mean you're paying more for oil than you're selling?
If I remember correctly, it was oil rents over GDP. So a number below 1 means that GDP is higher than oil rents. Yeah.
Any other questions? No? Okay, so then let's conclude our symposium here. Let's put another hand for our students and all the great work they did. I truly appreciate you all being here tonight. You all had like some, I mean, to me, you know, this is the one thing that I really enjoy. This semester I decided to like have my students present their work. And what I really enjoy is not only the students presenting the work and the things that they work for the whole semester, but what I truly, truly enjoy is seeing the audience asking these very, very smart questions. And I really appreciate all of you being here for your time and all these questions that have pushed us to even think more about the research. Typically, you don't really ask a researcher whether he or she likes the research. Of course, we love what we do and what we research and what we write and find is the best. But we appreciate you being here and challenging us with and giving us a few more ideas and things that we can do. There is never, and this is something that I truly believe, there is no research that it's perfect. There is no data that it's perfect. There is always, if you want, improvement that can be done. But without comments, without you being here asking us questions, without reviewers looking the work and submit, when we submit our articles, there wouldn't be any kind of like improvement into the things that we do. So we truly appreciate all of us here, your presence, and I hope, my students, that you have taken notes of all the great comments and ideas that were given, and we promise you we'll work and incorporate some of your ideas, but if we incorporate some of your ideas, you will have to like review our paper before we send it out. Okay, Danielle? All right, cool deal. And with that, thank you very much, and I hope you all have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.